Before his wedding to the daughter of New York's elite, the most powerful mafia boss in the city decided to test his fiancée in a way no one could ever imagine. He pretended to fly to Sicily for business, but instead hid inside a secret room within his own mansion, just to observe how she treated his sick mother when she thought no one was watching. What he discovered about his fiancée left him frozen in shock, but it was the humble caregiver's actions that made the cold-hearted mafia boss feel something he had never felt before. You won't believe what happened next. If this story touched your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story that will leave you speechless. The secret room lay deep inside the Moretti mansion, hidden behind a false wall in the library that no one knew about except Vincent and Marcus. Pale blue light from 6 security monitors washed over the face of the most powerful mafia boss in New York, carving his features into lines as sharp as a razor. This was the place where Vincent had once sat for hours, tracking enemies, plotting the destruction of anyone who dared betray the Moretti family. But today, his target wasn't an enemy outside these walls. It was the very woman he intended to marry in only a few weeks. Vincent remembered what his mother had told him before he carried out this plan. Maggie had taken his hand, her eyes heavy with worry, and said to watch how she treats your mother when she thinks you aren't looking, because that's her real face. He hadn't wanted to believe it. He'd tried to brush aside the doubts. But now, seated in the darkness of this secret room, he knew he had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The main screen showed the mansion's grand hall. Vincent saw Serena standing at the door, that sweet smile still on her lips after seeing him off to Sicily. She waved, her mouth forming tender words he didn't need to hear to know exactly what they were. I love you. I'll miss you. Come back to me soon. Words that only minutes ago he had still believed were real. The door closed, and in that instant, Vincent witnessed something that made his heart feel as if it were being crushed. The smile on Serena's lips vanished at once, as though someone had flipped a switch and shut off the light. The sweet, gentle face disappeared completely, replaced by an expression that was cold and calculating, one he'd never seen in the entire year he'd spent beside her. Serena pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed with hurried fingers. Vincent adjusted the audio on the system, and her voice rang out clearly in the secret room. He's gone. Finally gone. Come here now. He. Not darling. Not Vincent. Just he. As if he were nothing more than a piece on her board. A chill slid down Vincent's spine, but he didn't move. He'd lived in the underworld long enough to know that a rushed reaction only led to failure. He needed to know more. He needed to know everything. 20 minutes passed in silence. Vincent sat motionless as a statue, his gaze never leaving the screen. And then, a familiar car appeared at the mansion gates. The sleek black Audi Vincent had given his finance manager as a Christmas gift last year. Thomas Reed stepped out, glancing around with caution before hurrying inside. Something shattered in Vincent's chest as he watched what came next. Serena ran to him and threw her arms around Thomas right there in the center of the main hall. Their mouths found each other with the frantic hunger of people who'd been forced to hold back for too long. In the very place where Vincent had gone down on one knee to propose to Serena 6 months ago. In the very place where she'd cried and said, "This was the happiest moment of my life." It had all been lies. Every tear, every smile, every vow. Vincent's hand clenched the arm of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white. His jaw locked, and if anyone could have seen his eyes in that moment, they'd have seen the fires of hell blazing inside them. But he didn't rush out. Not because he was weak, not because he was afraid, but because he knew this was only the beginning. A con artist never has only one secret, and he needed to know everything before he moved. Vincent drew a deep breath, forcing the fury down to the very bottom of his heart, the way he'd done hundreds of times across 17 years of building an empire from ashes. He stared at the screen, where Serena and Thomas were still wrapped around each other, and he whispered in a voice so cold the air around him seemed to freeze. "Show me everything. Serena, show me who you really are." After the kiss in the hall, Serena and Thomas moved into the living room and sat down on the red velvet sofa Vincent had ordered from Italy as a birthday gift for her. Thomas poured a glass of wine, handed it to Serena, then sat beside her with a worried look. He said they needed to be patient, that after the wedding everything would be easier. But Serena cut him off, her voice sharp with irritation. She said she was sick to death of being patient. She'd had to play the perfect fiancé for a full year. Did Thomas have any idea how exhausting that was? Having to smile when she didn't want to smile. Having to say I love you when all she felt inside was contempt. Having to put up with that sick old woman every day as if the woman mattered. Vincent sat in the secret room, listening to every single word, and each sentence from Serena felt like a knife carving deeper into his heart. Serena set her glass down and stood, telling Thomas she needed to blow off some steam. She walked out of the living room, her high heels tapping a steady rhythm over the marble floor as she headed toward the door of Maggie's room at the end of the first-floor hallway. Vincent switched cameras fast, his heart pounding when he realized exactly where Serena was going. Inside Maggie's room, Eve was gently helping her sit up, handing her a glass of water and her morning pills. The young woman with brown hair neatly tied back was saying something that made Maggie smile, a rare smile on a face deeply marked by illness. The door flew open without a single knock. Serena stepped in, and the air in the room seemed to freeze instantly. She looked at Eve with eyes like ice and ordered, her voice stripped of all emotion, "Get out. I need to talk to her. Alone." Eve hesitated, her eyes flicking to Maggie with worry. Maggie gave a small nod, as if to tell her it was fine, to go ahead. Eve set the water on the table, lowered her head to Serena, and stepped outside. But she didn't go far. She stopped just beyond the door, uneasy, straining to hear what might happen inside. Vincent watched everything through the camera. He saw Eve standing there, saw the fear in her face, and silently thanked her for caring about his mother. But his attention snapped back to Serena the moment she began to speak. "You think you're important, you old woman?" Serena's voice rang out, nothing like the sweet tone Vincent had grown used to hearing. "You're just an obstacle. A burden." Maggie looked at Serena, her eyes steady, unshaken even as Serena's words dripped venom. Serena went on, her voice growing more vicious by the second. She said that after the wedding she'd put Maggie in the cheapest nursing home she could find, somewhere remote and miserable, somewhere Vincent wouldn't even bother visiting. Then she let out a cruel little laugh and said Maggie's precious son was so blind, he truly believed she loved him. Vincent felt the blood rush to his head. His hands began to shake, and the pen he was holding started to bend under the pressure of his fingers. But Serena wasn't finished. She stepped to the table where Maggie's pill tray sat, and with a movement full of contempt, she knocked the entire tray onto the floor, the pills scattered everywhere, skittering across the cold stone. Serena stared down at the mess, then looked back at Maggie with a wicked smile. "You don't need these. The sooner you go, the better it is for everyone." Maggie had been silent from the start. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't beg, she didn't plead. She'd lived 70 years. She'd seen enough of every kind of person to know someone like Serena wasn't worth lowering herself for. At last she spoke, her voice low and full of sorrow. "I pity you, Serena. You'll never know what real love is." Serena flinched for a second, as if those words had touched something buried deep inside her. But then anger flared, and she raised her hand and slapped Maggie across the face. Not hard, but hard enough to leave a red mark on the wrinkled skin of a 70-year-old woman. "Save your pity for yourself." Serena threw the words over her shoulder and turned on her heel, leaving Maggie alone in the room with pills scattered across the floor. In the secret room, the pen in Vincent's hand shattered. Black ink spilled out, staining his palm the color of the fury boiling through his veins. His whole body trembled, not from fear, but from a rage he'd never felt in 17 years as a Mafia boss. He whispered, his voice so cold the air around him seemed to turn to ice. "She dared to lay a hand on my mother." Eve stood outside the door, her heart pounding as she heard the crash from inside the room. She wanted to rush in, wanted to do something, but she knew she was only a caregiver, a housemaid with no right to speak in this house. The sharp click of high heels on the floor told her Serena was coming out. Eve quickly lowered her head, avoiding the gaze of the powerful woman. Serena walked past her without even looking, as if Eve were nothing more than an invisible object on the side of the road. But Eve felt the cold air that seemed to radiate from her, the cold of a heart without humanity. She waited until Serena's footsteps faded and disappeared at the end of the hallway, then immediately pushed the door open and stepped into Maggie's room. What she saw made Eve's heart feel as if it were being squeezed shut. Maggie sat on the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks, the red mark on her cheekbone still stark and fresh. On the floor, pills lay scattered everywhere, rolled beneath the bed, into the corner by the cabinet, into every place they could have bounced. Eve didn't say a word. She silently knelt on the cold stone and began picking up each pill one by one. Her hands carefully wiped each tablet clean with the hem of her blouse, checking whether any were cracked or ruined. These pills were Maggie's lifeline, what helped her fight Parkinson's disease as it slowly stole her control over her own body. Eve couldn't let a single one go to waste. In the secret room, Vincent watched through the camera, and the fury inside him suddenly eased, replaced by a strange feeling he couldn't name. He saw the young woman kneeling on the cold floor, gathering each pill, as if it were a precious gem. He saw her hands gently wiping them, one by one, without a complaint, without a sigh. Serena had knocked them down in a single second with contempt. Eve was recovering them one by one with devotion and love. The contrast pinned Vincent to his chair. When she had gathered all the pills, Eve rose, went to get a fresh glass of water, and returned to Maggie's bedside. She gently helped Maggie sit up, tucking another pillow behind her back so she could lean comfortably. "Maggie, let me help you take your medicine." Eve's voice was soft and warm, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Maggie looked at the young woman in front of her, and tears welled again. But this time they weren't the tears of humiliation and pain. They were tears of being deeply moved. She took Eve's hand, her voice trembling. "My child, you don't have to endure this for me. You should leave this house." Eve shook her head, her brown eyes shining with a steadiness no one could shake. She tightened her grip around Maggie's wrinkled hand and said, Maggie was her family, the only family she had left. She wouldn't abandon her. Not ever. Maggie choked on a sob. During the 2 years Eve had worked here, Maggie had come to see her as a daughter. The young woman with sad eyes and a smile that always stayed warm had brought her a comfort that even her own son couldn't give, because Vincent was always too busy with work. Eve had been with her through sleepless nights, had read to her whenever loneliness crept in, had massaged her stiff, numb legs every morning without a single word of complaint. And now, even after being treated cruelly, even though she could walk away at any moment, she still chose to stay. Serena called her a burden. Eve called her family. Serena wanted to push her as far away as possible. Eve swore she'd never leave her. Serena slapped her to prove power. Eve held her hand to give love. In the secret room, Vincent sat in silence. He watched Eve on the screen, the young woman seated beside his mother's bed, gently feeding her each pill, now and then lifting a hand to wipe the tears from her cheeks. He'd lived in this mansion for so many years, had passed this girl hundreds of times, and yet he'd never truly seen her. To him, she'd been only a shadow, one maid among many, a nameless face in a sprawling house. But now, for the first time, he really saw her, not a servant, not an invisible shadow, but a human being with a heart of pure gold, shining in the darkness of this mansion filled with lies. The real light didn't come from Serena with her dazzling beauty and sweet words. The real light came from the girl who knelt on the floor to gather scattered pills, who held his mother's hand and called her family. Vincent stared at the screen, and for the first time in years, a question not tied to business or enemies rose in his mind. "Who are you?" Eve Harper. That night, when the entire mansion had sunk into sleep, Eve sat alone in the small basement room reserved for the staff. The space was so cramped it was probably even smaller than Serena's bathroom, just large enough for a single bed, a small wardrobe, and an old, battered table. But Eve had never complained. She'd lived in places far worse than this. The pale yellow glow of an aging bedside lamp fell across her tired face as she sat on the bed, holding a photograph that time had turned yellow at the edges. In the picture was an 8-year-old girl with a wide, toothy grin, eyes clear as 2 drops of morning dew, brown hair tied into 2 neat little braids. Lily, her little sister, the sister she hadn't been able to save. Eve stroked the photo gently, and the painful memories rushed in like a wave that couldn't be stopped. She remembered being 10, the night her mother left. No goodbye, no explanation. The next morning, when Eve woke up, all she found was an empty closet and a crumpled scrap of paper with a jagged apology scrawled across it. "I'm sorry. I can't take it anymore." And just like that, the woman who'd given birth to her vanished from her life forever. Her father couldn't withstand the shock. Or maybe he'd been weak long before that. He turned to alcohol as a way to escape, and whenever he was drunk, he poured his rage onto innocent children. Eve remembered the nights she used her own body to shield Lily and Daniel, taking the blows so they wouldn't be hurt. She remembered Lily crying in the corner, Daniel trembling as he whispered, "Sister," and the strap cracking down onto her skin until the pain went numb. When Eve was 15, her father died of cirrhosis. He left behind nothing but a mountain of debt and 3 children who didn't know what they'd eat tomorrow. Eve dropped out of school and took every job she could to feed her brother and sister, washing dishes in restaurants, cleaning offices, delivering packages, anything that paid. She never complained. She only knew she had to be strong, because Lily and Daniel needed her. Then, when she was 17, Lily was diagnosed with leukemia. Eve remembered that day as if it had happened yesterday. She remembered the doctor's cold face as he delivered the terrible news. Remembered Lily's innocent eyes as she asked, "Sister, can this be cured?" Remembered the sensation of her heart being squeezed in a fist. Eve ran everywhere, begging, borrowing, working without stopping, but the hospital bills were too huge, and she was only a 17-year-old girl with nothing in her hands. Lily died in Eve's arms on a bitter winter night. Her little sister's last words still echoed in Eve's mind every night. Sister, don't cry. It doesn't hurt anymore. 8 years old. Lily had been only 8. Eve had never forgiven herself for failing to save her. Then 5 years ago, when Eve was 22, Daniel was diagnosed with kidney failure. History was repeating itself in a cruel, merciless loop, but this time, Eve swore to herself she wouldn't lose another sibling. No matter what it took, no matter what she had to endure, she would save Daniel. That was why she'd come here, working in the Moretti mansion for a salary higher than anywhere else would pay. Even if she had to endure Serena's contempt, even if she had to live in this cramped little room, as long as she could cover Daniel's medical bills. Eve set the photograph down and picked up her phone, dialing a familiar number. After a few rings, Daniel's weak voice came through. "How are you feeling today, Danny?" Eve asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm fine, sis. Don't worry about me. How's your job?" Eve smiled even though Daniel couldn't see it. "Everything's fine. I'll come see you this weekend, okay?" After she hung up, Eve sat still in the darkness. The smile on her lips slowly faded, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. She cried without making a sound, the way she'd cried for 10 years. Alone, in the dark, unseen, unheard. In the secret room, Vincent sat motionless before the screens. His sound system had captured the entire call and Eve's muffled sobs. He heard it all, and for the first time in many years, the heart of New York's coldest mafia boss tightened with pain. Not because of Serena's betrayal, but because of the crying of a girl carrying the whole world on her small shoulders. He wanted to step out of this room, wanted to go to her, wanted to tell her she wasn't alone, but he couldn't. Not yet. Not now. Vincent stared at Eve's image as she cried alone in the dark room, and whispered in a voice full of aching sorrow, "What have you been through, Eve? How can someone so broken still shine so brightly?" The second day since Vincent had pretended to leave for Sicily. That morning, Serena walked into Maggie's room to check on her, as part of a new, cruel routine she'd begun to enjoy. She wanted to make sure the hateful old woman was growing weaker without her medication. But when she saw Maggie propped against the headboard, her complexion healthier than it had been yesterday, Serena understood immediately that something was wrong. She strode to the bedside table, opened the pillbox to inspect it, and realized the number of tablets had dropped by exactly the proper dosage. Someone had defied her order. Someone had dared to do what she'd forbidden. Serena's anger flared in her chest like gasoline catching fire. She spun on her heel to find the person who dared challenge her authority, and it didn't take long to uncover the culprit. That afternoon in Maggie's room, Eve was kneeling beside the bed, gently massaging Maggie's numb legs. Her hands moved slowly, pressing into points that helped the blood flow more freely, a skill she'd taught herself from books so she could care for Maggie better. Maggie's eyes were closed, her face loosening into a rare moment of comfort. The door flew open with a violent bang. Eve startled and turned, and her heart sank when she saw Serena standing there with a face like ice and eyes blazing with hatred. Serena stepped inside, shut the door behind her, and advanced toward Eve with slow, threatening steps. "You gave her the medicine, didn't you?" Serena hissed like a venomous snake, each word dripping contempt. Eve rose to her feet and faced the woman in front of her. She knew what was coming, but she didn't run. She'd run too much in her life already. "Maggie needs her medication. It's my job to care for her." Eve's voice was calm, not a tremor of fear in it. Serena let out a thin laugh, a cold sound without warmth. Then, without a single warning, she raised her hand and struck Eve across the face with a slap that landed like lightning. The sound cracked through the quiet room like thunder. Eve's head snapped to the side from the force, her cheek burning, and she could taste blood where the corner of her mouth had split. "You're just a servant. Know your place," Serena screamed, her finger stabbing toward Eve's face. Maggie made a choked sound on the bed, trying to say something, but Serena whipped around and glared at her, forcing her into silence. In the secret room, Vincent surged out of his chair. His body went taut like a wire pulled to its breaking point, every instinct in him screaming to rush out, to protect her, to tear that woman apart. But Marcus's voice came through the earpiece. "Not yet, boss. We need more evidence." Vincent ground his teeth, his nails biting deep into his palm until blood began to seep out. He stared at the screen, where Eve was touching her burning cheek. But what shocked him was that she didn't cry. She didn't step back. She didn't bow her head. Eve looked straight into Serena's eyes, and in her brown gaze there was something Serena had never seen in any servant, an unbreakable resilience. "Hit me if you want. I won't hit you back, but I also won't stop caring for Maggie." Eve's voice carried through the room, strangely steady. Serena jolted. She was used to people fearing her, used to heads lowering before her power. But this girl, this ordinary caregiver, dared to look her in the eye as if she were nothing at all. Before Serena could react, Eve spoke again. "I've been hit before, by people far more terrifying than you. It didn't break me then, and it won't break me now." Serena took a step back, as if Eve's words had physical force. She couldn't understand how someone could be struck and still stand tall, still look into the eyes of the person who'd struck her without a hint of fear. It was beyond the comprehension of someone who'd never known real hardship. "You'll regret this," Serena gritted out. "After the wedding, you'll be the first one I throw out of this house." Eve nodded, not shaken in the slightest. "Then I'll care for her until that day." Serena had nothing else to say. She turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. But inside her, a feeling of unease began to spark to life. There was something about that girl that frightened her, a kind of strength money and power couldn't buy. In the room, Maggie looked at Eve with eyes full of tears. Her tears weren't from fear, and they weren't from the pain of watching Eve get hit. They were tears of pride, of admiration for the young woman in front of her. She whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "That girl has more courage than anyone I've ever known." In the secret room, Vincent sank back into his chair, his whole body shaking with restraint. Blood dripped from his palm to the floor, but he didn't feel it. The only pain he felt was in his chest, where his heart stabbed every time he saw the red mark on Eve's cheek. He spoke into the earpiece, his voice ice cold, yet holding a storm that was ready to be unleashed. "If she lays a hand on Eve one more time, I don't need any more proof. I'll kill her myself." Marcus was silent on the other end. He'd worked for Vincent long enough to know his boss never said things like that lightly. And for the first time in years, Marcus realized Vincent had placed someone on the same level as his mother in the circle of people he would protect. That ordinary caregiver everyone overlooked had, somehow, found her way into the heart of New York's coldest mafia boss. The second night fell like a black curtain drawn over the Moretti mansion. When everyone had retreated to their private rooms and the house sank into silence, Serena and Thomas found each other again in the living room. They didn't know that every corner of this room held hidden cameras. They didn't know that every word they spoke was being recorded by the ears of the man they were plotting to betray. Vincent sat in the secret room, his eyes fixed on the screen as Serena poured Thomas a drink and sat beside him on the sofa. The anger over Eve being struck was still smoldering inside him, but he knew he had to stay steady. He needed the whole truth before he moved. Thomas took a sip of wine, opened his leather briefcase, and pulled out a stack of documents. He told Serena the prenuptial agreement had been revised, and he had made sure of it. After the wedding, if there was a divorce, she would receive 60% of Vincent's assets. Serena frowned, her displeasure written plainly across her face. "Divorce," she said, was too slow. She asked about that other plan. Thomas set his glass down, his voice dropping as if someone might overhear even though the room was completely empty. He said the problem was the old woman. As long as she was alive and still lucid, she could still influence Vincent's decisions. They needed to declare her legally incompetent. Serena nodded, a vicious smile forming on her lips. She said she had a doctor who could be persuaded. Once Maggie was declared incompetent, they could move her to a nursing facility, out of sight, out of mind. Vincent felt his blood begin to boil as he listened. They were planning to put his mother in a nursing home, planning to have her branded as senile so they could cut her out of his life. His hand curled into a fist, but he held himself back. He kept listening. Thomas asked what came next, his voice thick with curiosity and greed. Serena leaned closer, lowering her voice into a poisonous whisper. Then they would wait, a few years, until Vincent trusted her completely. And when the right moment came, accidents happened all the time. She gave a cold laugh, and the sound sent a chill sliding down Vincent's spine. She didn't just want his money. She wanted him dead. Thomas laughed too. Then he began reporting what he had already done. He said he had transferred part of Vincent's money into an account in Switzerland, about $10 million so far, and Vincent had no idea. He had also forged Vincent's signature on several asset transfer papers, making sure that when everything broke open, they would already have enough money to disappear and start a new life in Europe. Serena kissed Thomas on the cheek as a reward for what he had done. She said that in just a few more years, they would have everything: Vincent's money, their freedom, and a life of luxury somewhere no one could ever find them. And Vincent, she said, would have nothing. No money, no mother, no life. In the secret room, Vincent sat very still. Everything he had just heard hit him like icy water thrown straight into his face, and at the same time like a flame burning away the last scraps of illusion he still carried about the woman he had planned to marry. He had already known Serena was betraying him with Thomas. He had already known she treated his mother with cruelty. But he hadn't expected their conspiracy to run this deep, to be this ruthless. They didn't just want his money. They wanted to destroy his mother. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to steal everything he had built over 17 years. Vincent stared at the screen where Serena and Thomas were still laughing, still mapping out wicked plans they believed would never be discovered. A smile slowly surfaced on his lips. It wasn't a smile of pleasure. It was the smile of a wolf watching its prey walk into the trap. Cold, dangerous, a promise of the storm that was coming for the people who had dared betray the Moretti family. She wanted to play games with a Moretti, he murmured, his voice threaded with menace. Then he would show her how they played. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. When Marcus answered, Vincent gave an order that was short and final. Dig deeper. Find out everything about Serena Blackwood. Everything. From the day she was born to now. I want to know who she really is. Marcus replied that he'd do it immediately. Vincent hung up and turned back to the screen. Serena and Thomas were still there, unaware that their fate had already been decided. They thought they controlled everything, thought Vincent was nothing but a foolish victim waiting to be slaughtered. But they were wrong. They had chosen the wrong opponent, and in Vincent Moretti's world, traitors had only one ending. The third day at the Moretti mansion began with an urgent call from Marcus. Vincent was sitting in the secret room, watching Serena through the cameras when his phone vibrated. He saw Marcus's name on the screen and answered at once. Marcus's voice on the other end came out tight and urgent. Nothing like his usual calm. Boss, I've got important information. Very important. I think you need to hear it right now. Vincent leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the camera feed. Say it. Marcus drew a long breath before he continued, as if even he couldn't quite believe what he was about to say. Boss, Serena Blackwood doesn't exist. Vincent frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? Marcus's tone turned even more serious as he explained. The real Serena Blackwood died in a car accident in Europe 5 years ago. The woman in your house, the one you were planning to marry. Her real name is Serena Miller. Vincent felt as if someone had driven a fist straight into his stomach. He went still, said nothing, and let Marcus keep talking. Marcus said Serena Miller was born in a slum on the outskirts of Chicago. Her father was a professional con man who taught her every trick when she was still a child. She grew up on lessons about forging documents, about stepping into someone else's skin, about manipulating minds to take money and property. 5 years ago, Serena Miller discovered that Serena Blackwood, the only daughter of a wealthy but reclusive family in New York, had died in an accident in France. That death wasn't widely announced because the Blackwood family wanted it kept private. Serena Miller saw an opening. She stole the identity, the papers, the entire history of the real Serena Blackwood. She appeared in New York as a Blackwood heiress, returning after years of studying in Europe. Marcus paused, then added something that shocked Vincent even more. The Blackwoods never had a daughter at all. They had adopted Serena Blackwood when she was only a few months old, and kept that secret from everyone. When the girl died, they were so devastated they chose silence, telling no one. Serena Miller exploited that. She studied the Blackwood family in detail, the daughter they'd lost, every scrap of information she could find. Then she showed up and played the role so perfectly that no one suspected a thing. The Blackwoods lived behind closed doors and rarely moved in society, so almost no one knew what the real Serena even looked like. And Serena Miller used that to build a flawless mask. Vincent remained silent for so long that Marcus finally asked if he was still there. I'm here, Vincent said at last, his voice low and cold as ice. He stared at the camera feed where Serena sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone, looking utterly carefree. She had no idea that the shell she'd spent 5 years building had just been stripped down to nothing. A bitter taste rose in Vincent's throat. He was a mafia boss. A man who'd survived countless wars in the underworld. A man who didn't trust easily. And yet he'd been fooled. Fooled by a professional fraud wearing the face of a polished heiress. He'd slept with her, proposed to her, planned to make her his wife. And it had all been theater. A carefully staged con meant to steal his wealth and, in the end, his life. Vincent drew a deep breath, letting the anger settle into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. She's not just greedy, he said slowly, each word like it had been carved from frozen stone. She's a professional con artist. Marcus replied that he'd gathered enough evidence. Serena Miller's file, fingerprints that didn't match the Blackwood records, suspicious financial transactions. All of it was there. With one order from Vincent, he could move immediately. Vincent nodded even though Marcus couldn't see him. This isn't about betrayal anymore. This is war. And in war, Vincent Moretti had never lost. He spoke into the phone, his voice steady with ruthless resolve. I want her destroyed, Marcus. Completely. Nothing left to crawl back to. Nowhere left to hide. She chose to play with fire, and now she's going to burn. On the afternoon of the third day, Serena began to feel uneasy. She realized that Eve was always close to Maggie, always present whenever Serena went into the old woman's room, as if she was trying to protect something, or worse, trying to eavesdrop on something. Serena wasn't a fool. She'd lived off the craft of deception long enough to know when someone was hiding something, and that small caregiver was hiding a great deal behind those gentle brown eyes. Eve was walking along the first-floor hallway, carrying a dinner tray for Maggie, when Serena suddenly appeared from a shadowed corner. Before Eve could react, Serena seized her by the collar and slammed her hard against the wall. The tray clattered to the floor, but Serena didn't care. Her eyes bored into Eve as if she meant to pierce straight through her soul. I know you've been listening. What did you say to that old woman? Serena hissed through clenched teeth, her voice thick with threat. Eve forced herself to stay calm, even as her heart raced out of control. I don't know what you're talking about. Serena gave a thin smile, a cold sound echoing through the empty corridor. Don't play dumb with me. I've got connections, Eve Harper. I know about your brother. Daniel, right? Kidney failure, waiting for a transplant. Eve jolted. Her eyes widened, and it felt as if someone had driven a knife straight into her heart. Daniel. She knew about Daniel. Serena saw the fear in Eve's eyes and felt satisfied. She'd found the prey's weak spot. She went on, her voice cruel. If you say one word to anyone, I'll make sure Daniel never gets a transplant. I can erase his name from the waiting list. He'll die while he waits. Eve trembled. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but the image of Daniel lying in a hospital bed, pale and fragile, rose in her mind. Her brother had suffered too much already. She couldn't let anything happen to him. Please, she choked out. Please leave my brother alone. It was the first time she'd ever begged Serena for anything. Serena let her go and looked at her with triumph in her eyes. Then keep your mouth shut. Understand? She turned and walked away, leaving Eve standing alone in the hallway, shaking and in pain. In the secret room, Vincent witnessed everything. Fury flared in him like fire hitting gasoline, but he held it down. Just one more day. Tomorrow, it would all end. That night, Eve couldn't sleep. She lay on the small bed in her cramped room, staring up at the black ceiling while her thoughts spun like a storm. She thought of Daniel, the brother she'd sworn to protect at any cost. She thought of Lily, the sister who'd died in her arms because she hadn't had enough money for treatment. She thought of everything she'd lost, everything she'd endured, and wondered if life would ever stop being cruel to her. Eve was afraid. Not afraid for herself, because she'd been living with pain for a long time. She was afraid for Daniel. She was afraid that if she made one wrong move, her brother would pay the price. And yet she also couldn't abandon Maggie, the woman who'd treated her like a daughter, who'd given her the feeling of being loved, something she'd never truly had in all her 27 years. Eve sat up, turned on the lamp, and took out a sheet of paper and a pen. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know what Serena would do to her. But she wanted to leave something behind, in case the worst happened. She began to write, one word at a time, with her whole heart. Dear Maggie, if anything happens to me, please know that you're the mother I never had. Caring for you isn't a job, it's an honor. Please be strong. I love you, Eve. She folded the letter, placed it in the drawer, and sat in silence in the dark. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, the way she'd let every sorrow fall through her entire life. In the secret room, Vincent watched Eve write the letter through the camera. He couldn't read the words from this angle, but he saw her shoulders trembling, saw tears tracking down her face, saw her fold the letter with shaking hands. And then, as if an invisible force pushed him, Vincent ordered the system to zoom in. He saw the letter in the drawer, saw the crooked lines of handwriting, raw with sincerity. He read every word, and something in his chest suddenly broke apart. Tears, the thing the Mafia boss believed had dried up 17 years earlier when his father was killed, suddenly wet the corners of his eyes. He didn't cry when he discovered Serena's betrayal. He didn't cry when he learned she meant to kill him. But he cried when he read the letter of a small, battered girl preparing for her own death, still thinking only of leaving love behind for someone else. Enough. Tomorrow, I end it all, Vincent whispered, his voice filled with resolve. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. Change the plan. We move tomorrow. Earlier than planned. I'm not letting her endure one more day. On the morning of the fourth day, 3 days earlier than the original plan, The sound of an engine rolled up outside the gates of the Moretti mansion. The first light of morning had only just touched the garden when Vincent's gleaming black Rolls-Royce slowly turned onto the stone drive. In the dining room, Serena was eating breakfast with Thomas, as she had every day since Vincent left. They'd grown bolder, no longer hiding their relationship inside the house itself, convinced there were still many days before they needed to worry about the boss returning. When she heard that familiar engine, Serena dropped her fork, ran to the window, and looked down into the courtyard. Her face went pale as if she'd seen a ghost. "It's Vincent. He's back early." Thomas shot to his feet, nearly knocking over the coffee on the table. "What? How?" Serena spun toward him, panic blazing in her eyes. "Hide. Now. Out the back." Thomas didn't need to hear it twice. He snatched up his jacket and bolted for the rear door, disappearing into the back garden in seconds. Serena drew a deep breath, forcing herself to steady. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her silk nightdress, and made her face go calm again. She'd been acting for a year. She could keep acting a little longer. The front door opened and Vincent walked in. He wore a dark gray suit, his black hair slicked neatly back, his handsome face carved as if from marble. To anyone watching, he'd look like a successful businessman returning from a trip. They wouldn't see the Mafia boss holding back a rage that could burn the world to ash. Serena rushed to greet him, her face bright with the smile she'd practiced 1,000 times in the mirror. "My love, you're back so early. I missed you so much." She wrapped her arms around Vincent and kissed his cheek with a flawless imitation of affection. Vincent smiled, his hands settling around her waist the way they always did. But if Serena had been sharper, she would have noticed that the embrace carried no warmth, that the smile never reached his eyes. "I couldn't stay away from you. Sicily is boring without you beside me," Vincent replied, his voice sweet as honey, but cold as ice to anyone who truly knew how to listen. Serena let out a quiet breath of relief. She didn't sense anything wrong. She only saw her fiancé back home, still loving her the way he always had, still blindly trusting her, just as she'd worked so hard to make him do. Vincent kissed her forehead, a gesture he'd done hundreds of times. But this time, while his lips rested against Serena's skin, his eyes shifted toward the rear door, the one Thomas had just fled through. That gaze was ice cold, sharp as a blade, promising a storm about to break over the heads of those who dared betray the Moretti family. They went into the living room, and Serena began asking about his trip to Sicily. She played the perfect soon-to-be wife, attentive and warm, asking about work, the weather, the people he'd met. Vincent answered every question with the calm of a seasoned actor, describing meetings that hadn't happened, meals that didn't exist, scenery he'd never seen, because he'd never left the secret room for 4 straight days. Serena believed every word. She had no reason to doubt him. In her eyes, Vincent was still the wealthy, powerful man who was foolishly in love, ready to trust her without condition. She didn't know that this man had witnessed everything, had heard every word, had recorded every piece of proof, and was waiting for the right moment to strike. That afternoon, Vincent suggested something that made Serena slightly surprised, but not suspicious. "Tonight, let's have a special family dinner," he said, his voice bright with practiced excitement. "You, me, my mother, and Eve too. I want to celebrate coming home safely." Serena's brows tightened at the mention of Eve, but she quickly hid her irritation. "Why Eve? She's only a caregiver." Vincent smiled, a smile Serena couldn't quite read. "Eve took very good care of my mother while I was away. I want to thank her. And besides, she's like family now." Serena swallowed her anger. She hated Eve, hated how the girl was always at Maggie's side, hated the way she looked at Serena with eyes that didn't know fear, but she couldn't refuse Vincent. Not now. Not with the wedding only weeks away. "All right, my love. That sounds wonderful," Serena said, wearing the sweetest smile she could manage. She had no idea this dinner wouldn't be an ordinary family meal. She had no idea it would be her trial. She had no idea that when the sun sank past the New York skyline tonight, the life she thought she controlled would end. And Vincent, standing by the window and looking out over the garden, wore a cold smile Serena couldn't see. Every piece was in place. The board had been set, and the Mafia boss was about to make his final move. On the afternoon of the 4th day, after Serena went to take her nap in her private room, Vincent quietly made his way to Maggie's room. He knocked softly before stepping inside, and the first thing he saw was his mother sitting up in bed, her eyes lighting up the moment she recognized her son. Eve stood beside her, holding a book she'd just been reading aloud. When she saw Vincent, Maggie burst into tears. The tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks as she opened her arms wide for him. "You're home, my son." Her voice trembled with emotion. Vincent went to the bed and wrapped his mother in a tight embrace. In her arms, he felt like a child again, like the old days when his father was still alive and life hadn't forced him to become a cold mafia boss. He leaned close to her ear and whispered, low enough that only the two of them could hear, "I know everything, Mom. I've seen it all." Maggie pulled back and looked into her son's eyes. There was no surprise there, only relief and an unshakable faith in the son she'd given birth to and raised. "Then you know what you have to do." Her voice was steadier than it had been in a long time. Vincent nodded. He would do what needed to be done. But before he did, there was someone else he had to speak to. His gaze moved to Eve, who stood silent in the corner, trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she didn't want to intrude on a mother and son reunion. And then he saw it. The bruise on her arm, where Serena had grabbed her and slammed her into the wall yesterday. The bruise on her cheek, still slightly swollen from the earlier slap. Vincent's heart tightened at the sight of those marks on her body. Marks he'd watched through the cameras but was now seeing with his own eyes. "Eve, could you step out into the hallway with me for a moment?" Vincent said, his voice unusually gentle. Eve looked up, her brown eyes filled with surprise and worry. She glanced at Maggie as if asking permission, and Maggie nodded with a comforting smile. "Go on, my dear. It's all right." Eve followed Vincent into the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know why the boss wanted to speak with her alone, and 1,000 terrible scenarios began to bloom in her mind. Had Serena said something to him? Was she about to be fired? And what about Daniel? When they were standing in the empty hallway, where no one could overhear, Vincent turned to face her. "Tell me everything, Eve. What happened while I was away?" Eve lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. I can't, Mr. Moretti. Please don't ask me." Her voice was barely more than breath, thick with fear. She thought of Serena's threat about Daniel, thought of her brother dying because he'd never get a transplant, and she couldn't force out a single word. Vincent looked at the trembling girl in front of him, and something in his chest softened. He lifted a hand gently, tipping her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." His voice was tender in a way it had never been with anyone. "I know what Serena did. I know she threatened you." Eve jolted. Her eyes widened as she stared at him in disbelief. You know?" Vincent nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I saw everything. Every slap. Every word. Every tear you cried alone in your room." And that was when Eve couldn't hold it in any longer. She broke down, tears pouring out as if a dam had finally shattered. For so many years, she'd carried everything alone, fought life alone, cried in the dark alone where no one knew. And now, for the first time, someone knew. Someone stood on her side. Someone had seen her pain. Vincent watched her cry, and without thinking, he raised his hand and wiped the tears from her cheeks. It was a gesture the coldest mafia boss in New York hadn't made for anyone in 17 years. But with Eve, everything was different. "No one's going to hurt you anymore, Eve. I promise. Not while I'm still alive." Vincent's voice rang with resolve and protection. Eve looked into his eyes, and for the first time in her life, she saw something she'd never seen in anyone. Real protection. Without conditions. Without demands. Just a promise from a man willing to shield her from the whole world. The main dining room of the Moretti mansion had been dressed as if for a royal banquet. White candles burned with a soft shimmer beneath the crystal chandelier, their flames dancing and throwing reflections across walls draped in deep red velvet paper. White roses stood in a crystal vase at the center of the table, beside expensive bottles of red wine from the Moretti family cellar. Everything was flawless, from the silver place settings to the napkins folded with meticulous care. Yet the air in the room felt heavy, the way it does before a major storm, as if everyone could sense that something frightening was about to happen. Vincent sat at the head of the table, in the seat his father had occupied for so many years. He wore a black suit, the collar of his white shirt left slightly open, looking both elegant and dangerous. His face was calm in a way that was almost terrifying, like a still lake hiding lethal currents underneath. Serena sat to his right, in a tight red dress that emphasized her sensuality. She tried to wear her usual sweet smile, but there was an unease in her eyes she couldn't fully disguise. Thomas Reed sat across from Serena, and that was what unsettled her most. Vincent had invited Thomas to stay for dinner, claiming he wanted to thank him for managing the finances well while he was away. Thomas couldn't refuse, and now he sat there rigid as stone, sweat beading on his forehead even though the dining room was cool with air conditioning. Maggie sat in her wheelchair at one end of the table, silently observing everything with the clear sight of a woman who'd lived 70 years. She knew something would happen tonight, and she was ready. Eve stood nearby, prepared to serve the meal as always. She wore the simple uniform of a housemaid, a white blouse and black trousers, her brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. But before she could pour wine for anyone, Vincent spoke. "Eve, sit down." His voice wasn't a request, it was an order. Eve blinked, looking at him with confusion. "But I need to serve." Vincent shook his head. "Tonight, you're a guest. Sit down." Serena couldn't hide the irritation that flashed across her face. She turned to Vincent with practiced confusion. "Vincent, why is the maid sitting at our table?" Vincent looked at Serena, and for a single moment his eyes turned so cold that she had to swallow. "Because I want her here. Is that a problem?" His voice remained gentle, but there was an invisible weight behind every word that kept Serena from arguing. "No, of course not," she said, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. Eve sat in the chair Vincent indicated, across from Maggie. Maggie looked at her and gave a small nod, a silent reassurance that everything would be all right. The meal began under a silence so tight it felt suffocating. The servers brought each course, and everyone ate without speaking, the only sound the faint clink of cutlery against porcelain. Thomas was sweating through his clothes, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped his fork. He didn't dare look at Vincent, didn't dare look at Serena. He only stared down at his plate as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Vincent broke the silence with mild questions, but each one landed like a blade in the hearts of the guilty. He asked about his trip to Sicily, forcing Serena to act interested. He asked about Thomas's work, forcing him to answer in a trembling voice. He asked about his mother's health while he'd been away, and that question made Serena's face go pale for a single second before she recovered. When the main course ended, Vincent rose slowly, holding a glass of red wine in his hand. Every gaze turned toward him. "I've got a special presentation for all of you tonight," he said, his voice carrying through the silent room. A celebration of honesty. A chill slid down Serena's spine. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. But before she could say or do anything, Vincent pressed the button on the remote in his hand. The large television mounted on the wall lit up, and the first image that appeared made Serena's blood turn to ice. It was her and Thomas, wrapped around each other in the center of the main hall, in the very place where Vincent had proposed to her 6 months earlier. Serena went white as death. Thomas dropped his fork to the floor with a clatter that rang out in the deadly silence. And Vincent, he only stood there, wearing a smile as cold as ice, his eyes burning the traitors with the fires of hell. The video kept playing on the large screen, and Vincent didn't need to say another word. The images told the story all by themselves. The next scene showed Serena standing in Maggie's room, her face twisted with hatred as she screamed at the 70-year-old woman. "You think you're important, you old woman. You're just an obstacle, a burden." Serena's voice on the video rang out clearly in the dead-quiet dining room. The real Serena, the one sitting at the table, went paler and paler as if all the blood were draining out of her body. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain, but the video gave her no mercy. The image shifted to Serena, knocking Maggie's pill tray onto the floor, then slapping her across the face. "Save your pity for yourself." Eve lifted her eyes to the screen, her heart tightening as she was forced to watch Maggie being treated with such cruelty again. Maggie sat silent in her wheelchair, her face expressionless, as if she'd been bracing for this moment for a long time. The video continued. This time it showed Serena slapping Eve hard in Maggie's room. "You're just a servant. Know your place." Serena began to tremble. Her hands clenched the napkin in her lap, trying to hold back the panic rising in her chest. But the video didn't stop. It went on to show her and Thomas in the living room, talking about stealing Vincent's assets. After the wedding, if there's a divorce, you'll get 60% of his property. Then came the scene of them discussing declaring Maggie legally incompetent. And finally, the line that froze the entire room. "Accidents happen all the time." Serena's voice in the video laughed, cold and sharp. Thomas couldn't take it anymore. He sprang up so fast his chair crashed to the floor with a bang, and he lunged toward the door. But at that exact moment, the dining room doors opened. Marcus walked in, followed by 6 large men in black suits, their faces cut from ice. They moved fast, surrounding the room and sealing every exit. Thomas stopped short like a deer caught in headlights, his face white as paper. Serena looked around and realized she was completely trapped. She turned to Vincent, her eyes wild with desperation. "Vincent, please, let me explain." Her voice shook as she tried to salvage what little was left. Vincent gave a thin smile, a sound so cold it seemed to freeze the air. "Explain what? Explain how you plan to put my mother in a nursing home? Explain how you hit the only person who truly cared for her? Explain how you threatened to kill someone I care about?" Serena couldn't hold herself up anymore. She collapsed onto the floor, sobs spilling out like water. She crawled toward Vincent, grabbing for the leg of his trousers like a desperate beggar. "Please, Vincent, I love you. I really love you." Vincent looked down at her with the cold stare a man might give an insect. "Love? You don't know what that word means." He kicked her hand away and stepped back, as if her touch were something filthy. And then, as if what had already happened still wasn't enough, Vincent added the words that shook Serena to the bone. "Oh, and one more thing. I know you're not Serena Blackwood." Serena lifted her head, her eyes widening in horror. All color drained from her face, leaving it the pale white of a corpse. Vincent went on, his voice ice cold. "The real Serena Blackwood died in a car accident in Europe 5 years ago. And you're Serena Miller. A con man's daughter. A fraud. A nobody." Serena couldn't even cry anymore. She just sat there, mouth open but no sound coming out, like a fish thrown onto shore. Everything she'd built for 5 years, the flawless mask she'd worked so hard to create, all of it collapsed in a single night. Thomas saw Serena exposed completely and understood there was no escape. He dropped to his knees, hands pressed together as if in prayer, and began spilling everything. The money moved overseas, the forged documents, every plan they'd made. He begged Vincent to spare his life, tears and snot running down his pathetic face. Vincent didn't even look at him. He gave a short command, his voice cold and final. "Take them. They're going to learn what it means to betray a Moretti." Marcus nodded and signaled his men. 2 of them stepped forward and hauled Thomas to his feet. He didn't dare resist, only sobbed and pleaded as he was dragged from the room. 2 others moved in on Serena, seized her arms, and pulled her upright. Now her despair turned into wild, furious rage. She screamed, struggled, fought to wrench herself free, and as she was dragged past where Eve stood, she shrieked, her eyes red with hatred. "This isn't over. I'll destroy you." Eve didn't speak. She only stood still, watching Serena being pulled away with calm eyes. She didn't feel fear, and she didn't feel hatred, only a strange peace settling inside her. When Serena and Thomas had been taken out, Vincent walked over to Eve. His voice, which had been ice only seconds ago, softened into something almost unbelievable. "It's over. She'll never hurt anyone again." 1 week after that night of judgment, the Moretti mansion returned to its familiar quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet now, no longer weighed down by lies and dark schemes. Spring sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, carrying warmth and a sense of hope into every room. Serena Miller, the woman who had nearly become the mistress of this house, had vanished from New York as if she'd never existed. Vincent didn't kill her, and he didn't kill Thomas either. In the world of a mafia boss, death could sometimes be too easy a release. Instead, he confiscated every dollar they'd stolen, exposed Serena's true identity to New York's upper circles, and made sure that not a single door in this city, or in any city touched by the Moretti family's influence, would ever open to them again. When Marcus asked why he didn't simply end them once and for all, Vincent only gave a cold smile and said death was too easy. He wanted them to live and know they'd lost everything. As the darkness of the past slowly dissolved, a new chapter began to open for the ones who remained. That afternoon, Vincent called Eve to his office. She stepped inside with her familiar worry, unsure what she'd done wrong. The room was vast, lined with bookshelves that rose to the ceiling and dominated by a massive oak desk that had always made her feel small. But today, seeing Vincent seated there with gentleness in his eyes, she felt a little less afraid. "From now on, you're not a caregiver anymore. You're family." Vincent said it in a voice so warm that Eve had never heard that kind of warmth from him before. Eve stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "I don't understand, Mr. Moretti." The words stumbled out of her, because she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Vincent rose and stepped closer. "You'll have your own room. A real room, not a staff room. You'll eat with us, not serve us." He paused, looking into her eyes. "And please, call me Vincent." Eve wanted to refuse. She was used to being the help, used to staying in the shadows, used to believing she didn't deserve good things. She opened her mouth to say something, but at that moment the office door opened, and Maggie appeared in her wheelchair, a gentle smile on her lips. "Take it, my daughter. You deserve it." Her voice was soft, but it carried a quiet certainty that made it impossible to argue. Eve looked at Maggie, then looked at Vincent, and tears began to gather in her brown eyes. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to a kindness she'd never truly received in all her 27 years. But that wasn't all. Vincent continued, and there was a rare hesitation in his voice. And about your brother, Daniel. Eve jolted at the sound of his name. She'd tried not to think about Daniel all week, tried not to think about the bills piling up, about the transplant she didn't know how she'd ever afford. Vincent met her gaze and went on. Every hospital bill has been paid. He's been transferred to the best hospital in New York, and they found a matching kidney donor. The transplant will happen in 2 weeks. Eve couldn't believe what she was hearing. She stared at Vincent with tears in her eyes, her mouth open but no sound coming out. Daniel would be saved. Her brother, the only family she had left, would live. Who did this? She finally managed, her voice breaking with emotion. Vincent didn't answer. He only gave a small, mysterious smile and turned away to look out the window as if the question didn't matter. But Eve understood anyway. She knew who had done it. She knew who had saved her brother. And she couldn't find words big enough to thank him, because no thank you could ever be enough. Maggie opened her arms, and Eve went to her, dropping to her knees beside the wheelchair and letting Maggie pull her close. "You're our family now, my daughter. You always have been," Maggie whispered, her hand stroking Eve's hair. Eve cried in her embrace, and for the first time in her 27 years, she felt what real motherly love was like. She'd lost her mother as a child, lost her father, lost her sister, but now she'd found a new family, a place where she belonged. Vincent stood by the window, watching the two women hold each other. A faint smile touched his mouth, an honest smile the cold Mafia boss had forgotten for a very long time, and in that moment, he knew he'd done the right thing. Not because he'd taken revenge on Serena, but because he'd given happiness to someone who truly deserved it. It was very late at night, when the entire mansion had fallen asleep, and only moonlight streamed through the tall glass windows. Vincent moved quietly to Maggie's room, tapped softly, then stepped inside. She still wasn't asleep, as if she'd known her son would come. Vincent pulled a chair up beside his mother's bed and sat down, the way he used to when he was 10 years old, on the nights he couldn't sleep and came to her for comfort. Maggie looked at him with eyes full of love and understanding. She knew Vincent hadn't come only to check on her. Something was weighing on him, and she could guess what it was. "You've been watching her, haven't you, Eve?" Maggie spoke first, her voice gentle and warm. Vincent lifted his head, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He stayed quiet for a long moment before he answered. "Am I that obvious?" Maggie laughed, a soft, affectionate sound. "A mother always knows. It's instinct." Vincent let out a slow breath, leaned back in the chair, and stared up at the ceiling. He didn't know how to put into words what was happening inside him. For 17 years, he'd built a wall around his heart and let no one in. And now a small young woman with sad eyes and a warm smile had found a way to break through that wall without him even realizing it. "I don't know what I'm feeling anymore, Mom. After what happened with Serena, I don't know if I can trust anyone again." His voice dropped, thick with uncertainty and hesitation. Maggie reached out and took his large hand in hers. Her hand was wrinkled and trembling from illness, but its warmth flowed into Vincent like an invisible strength. "Serena was a mirror, my son. She only reflected what you wanted to see." Maggie spoke slowly, each word carrying the wisdom of a woman who'd lived 70 years. "But Eve is a window. She shows you exactly who she is, even the parts that are broken." Vincent fell silent, turning his mother's words over in his mind. He thought of Serena, of the false perfection she'd built, of how he'd blindly believed what he wanted to believe. Then he thought of Eve, of how she cried alone in the dark, of how she knelt to pick up every pill, of how she stood straight in front of Serena even after being slapped. Eve wasn't perfect, she was broken, and she'd suffered too much. But that brokenness made her more real than anyone he'd ever met. "But what if I hurt her? What if I don't know how to love anyone?" Vincent asked, his voice filled with worry. This was his deepest fear, that he'd lived in darkness so long he no longer knew how to love. Maggie smiled and squeezed his hand tighter. "The fact that you're asking that question already proves you love her. Vincent, a man who doesn't care wouldn't ask whether he might cause someone pain." Vincent felt something warm spread through his chest, as if his mother's words had lit a lamp in the darkness he'd lived in for so many years. He stood, bent down, and kissed his mother's forehead. Before he could leave the room, Maggie spoke again, her voice rising softly in the still night. "I told you to watch how she treated me when she thought no one was looking. You did, and you found something real. Don't let fear steal it from you." Vincent paused at the doorway and looked back at his mother one last time. He nodded, and in his heart, a decision had been made. In the weeks that followed that night of conversation with his mother, Vincent changed in ways even he didn't fully notice. He began spending more time at home, fewer meetings, fewer late nights in his office. Marcus noticed the shift and only smiled, saying nothing. Maggie noticed too, and in her heart she quietly thanked fate for bringing Eve into their family. One early summer morning, when warm golden sunlight filled the garden behind the mansion, Vincent stepped onto the balcony and saw Eve watering Maggie's flowers. She wore a simple floral dress, her brown hair tied up high, exposing the soft curve of her neck. She was smiling, talking to the flowers as if they could understand her, and her laughter was clear and bright, like wind chimes. Vincent stood there, not wanting to break the peace of the moment. He only watched, and realized that for the first time in many years, he felt this calm, as if every darkness in his life dissolved when he saw her smile. Eve seemed to sense someone watching. She turned, and her brown eyes met Vincent's gaze from the balcony. Her cheeks flushed red like ripe apples, and she quickly bent down, pretending to focus on the flowers, not daring to look up again. Vincent smiled, a smile he didn't know he still had in him. Family dinners became a new habit at the Moretti mansion. Vincent, Maggie, and Eve sat around the table, not in the grand formal dining room, but in the warm kitchen under soft yellow light. One night, while they ate, Vincent asked Eve about her life, about what she liked, about her dreams. Eve grew flustered, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. No one had ever asked her those things. For 27 years, she'd only known work, endurance, survival. Dreams were a luxury she hadn't dared to imagine. "I've never really thought about dreams. I've been too busy surviving." Her voice was quiet, not complaining, simply telling the truth. Vincent looked at her, his eyes gentle in a way only his mother had ever seen. "Then it's time you start dreaming." He said it like a promise, like a commitment that he would give her the room to dream. One late night, when the mansion had fallen asleep, Eve couldn't sleep. She climbed up to the rooftop where she could see all of New York glittering with lights. She didn't expect she wouldn't be alone. Vincent was already there, leaning against the railing, looking out into the distance as if he were searching for something in the dark. "You can't sleep either?" he asked when he noticed her, his voice quiet in the still night. Eve nodded and came to stand beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. They simply stood together in silence, watching the city lights flicker like a million stars fall into earth. And then, in that moment, their hands brushed. No one knew who touched first. No one knew whether it was accidental or intentional. But when their fingers met, neither of them pulled away. They left their hands there, feeling each other's warmth in the cool night air. "Why are you so good to me, Vincent?" Eve finally asked, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. Vincent turned to look at her. Moonlight fell across Eve's face, highlighting the clear brown of her eyes and the gentle lines of her features. In that moment, he thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. "Because you showed me what real kindness looks like, and I want to learn from you." His answer was so sincere it made Eve's heart miss a beat. They stood there, looking into each other's eyes in silence. No more words were needed. They both knew something was changing between them, something beautiful and precious taking shape. Slowly, from moments this small. A month had passed since that night on the rooftop. Daniel had received his kidney transplant successfully and was recovering well in the hospital. Eve was happier than she'd ever been, watching her brother smile, hearing his voice grow stronger with each passing day. But Vincent noticed that in her brown eyes there was still a deep sorrow that never fully disappeared, an old wound that had never truly healed. And he knew that sorrow had a name: Lily. One weekend afternoon, when warm golden sunlight filled the mansion, Vincent went to Eve with an unexpected offer. "There's a place I want to take you today." Eve was surprised, but she nodded. She'd learned how to trust Vincent, to trust the protection and warmth he'd brought into her life over the past months. The gleaming black Rolls-Royce glided through New York's streets, away from the noisy heart of the city, heading toward a quieter stretch of suburb. Eve watched through the window, not knowing where they were going, but she didn't ask. She trusted Vincent. When the car stopped, Eve looked out and felt her heart miss a beat. In front of her was a cemetery, rows of white headstones resting in silence beneath the shade of ancient oak trees. She turned to Vincent, her eyes full of questions and a flicker of worry. Vincent didn't explain. He simply stepped out, walked around to her side, and opened the door for her. In his hand was a bouquet of pure white flowers she hadn't seen him prepare. He took her hand and guided her along paths of pale gravel, past quiet headstones, until they stopped before a small grave beneath the shadow of a cherry tree. Eve read the name on the stone and her knees nearly gave out. Lily Harper, 2009 to 2017. Forever in our hearts. Her sister, the 8-year-old girl who had died in Eve's arms 10 years ago. The grave she hadn't had the money to visit for so many years because it was too far away, and she had been too poor. "How did you know?" Eve whispered, her voice catching. "I know everything about you, Eve, including the sister you lost," Vincent answered, his voice gentle and full of love. He knelt in front of the small grave and laid the white flowers on the green grass. And then he did something that broke Eve open in tears. "Hi, Lily. My name is Vincent. I want to thank you for sending your sister into my family. She saved my mother. She saved me." Vincent spoke to the grave as if Lily were there, listening, smiling. No one had remembered Lily but Eve. No one had spoken about her little sister as if she still existed. But Vincent did. He brought Eve here, spoke to her sister, let Lily know she hadn't been forgotten. Eve cried. Not the sharp, broken tears she'd cried 10 years ago when Lily took her last breath in Eve's arms. These were tears of healing, of finally being understood, of having someone share the grief she'd carried alone for so long. Vincent rose, turned to Eve, and saw her crying. He knelt beside her, lifted his hand, and wiped the tears from her cheeks with endless tenderness. And in that moment, beneath the cherry tree and under Lily's witness, he spoke the words he'd been holding inside for weeks. "Eve, I don't know how to love. I've lived in darkness so long I forgot what light looks like." His voice dropped, raw with sincerity, with a slight tremble that was rare in a man as powerful as him. "But when you smile, the darkness in me fades. When you cry, I want to destroy the whole world just to make you smile again." He kept talking, his eyes never leaving her tear-filled brown gaze. "You're the light I don't deserve, but I'm willing to spend my whole life becoming worthy of you." Eve looked at him through her tears, and in her eyes there was no longer sorrow, only love and a boundless gratitude. "You don't have to be worthy, Vincent. You just have to be with me." Her voice was a whisper carried on the wind. Vincent looked at her, and in that instant, every wall he'd built over 17 years collapsed completely. He bent down, and his mouth met hers in their first kiss. That kiss was gentle as breath, sweet as morning sunlight, and deep as the love they'd found in each other. They kissed right beside Lily's grave, beneath a burning red sunset settling over the cemetery. Darkness met light. Pain met healing. Two broken souls found each other in a world full of lies and betrayal. And in that moment, they both knew they'd found home. Not a house made of brick and mortar, but a home inside each other's hearts, where they belonged, where they could be loved, where they could finally be at peace. 1 year after the day they shared their first kiss beside Lily's grave, Vincent and Eve stood facing each other in the garden behind the Moretti mansion. This wasn't the wedding of the century Vincent had once planned with Serena. There were no hundreds of guests from New York's upper circles, no outrageously expensive gowns, no lavish performances. It was only a small ceremony beneath the canopy of a cherry tree in full bloom, with white wooden chairs arranged in 2 neat rows and white ribbons drifting softly in the breeze. Maggie sat in the first row in a pale blue dress, tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks as she watched her son stand before the flower-covered arch. Beside her was Daniel, now healthy and full of life after his successful kidney transplant, smiling at his sister with undisguised pride. Marcus stood behind Vincent as best man, and for the first time in 20 years of serving the Moretti family, that cold man wore a real smile. A few of the family's closest people were there too, the ones who'd watched Vincent grow up and were now watching him find real happiness. Eve walked down the aisle, scattered with white petals, and Vincent thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She wore a simple white dress, not a costly designer piece, with no diamonds or gemstones, but it was perfect on her. In her hands she held a small bouquet of white flowers, the kind Lily had loved most, as if her sister were present on this sacred day. After they spoke their vows, Maggie was invited to say a few words. She sat in her wheelchair, her voice trembling with emotion, yet carrying clearly through the quiet garden. "I told my son to watch how someone treats me when they think no one is looking. You did, and you didn't find a princess. You found something far better. A warrior with a gentle heart." She paused and looked at Eve with eyes full of love. "Eve, welcome to our family. You've always belonged here." Eve cried, Daniel cried, and even Vincent felt his eyes sting. After the ceremony, while the guests chatted happily in the garden, Vincent went to his mother and held her tight. "Thank you, Mom. For everything," he whispered into her ear. Maggie smiled and patted his back the way she used to when he was a boy. "I only showed you the door. You're the one who walked through it." Late the night after the wedding, when silver moonlight filled the New York sky, Vincent and Eve stood on the rooftop of the Moretti mansion, the very place where they'd first stood side by side almost a year ago. From the living room below came the laughter of Daniel and Maggie, the two of them playing chess together as if they'd been grandmother and grandson for generations. The sound was warm and strangely peaceful, as if this mansion, once filled with darkness and lies, had finally been filled with love and laughter instead. Eve leaned against the railing, looking out at the city lights, glittering like a million stars. She felt the warmth of Vincent beside her, and she knew she'd found where she belonged after 27 years of being lost in the world. "Thank you for saving me, Vincent," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. Vincent turned to her, the moonlight softening the hard lines of the powerful Mafia boss. "No, Eve, you're the one who saved me," he answered, his voice low and honest. "I was lost in the dark for 17 years. I thought I'd never find my way out," he went on, his eyes drifting into the night, as if he were remembering the lonely, frozen years. "But you showed me that even in the deepest darkness, there's always light, and that light is you." Eve felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, but they were happy tears. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steadiness and warmth of the man she loved. "Then let's be each other's light, forever." Her words sounded like a vow. Vincent kissed her forehead, his lips warm and gentle. "Forever," he replied, and that one word carried every promise he would keep for the rest of his life. They stood there, two silhouettes folded into one beneath the moon, looking out over a city asleep. Darkness had met light, pain had met healing, and two hearts that had once been shattered had found home in each other. In a world full of darkness and betrayal, sometimes the truest light doesn't come from wealth or glittering places. It comes from the hearts of people who've walked through the darkest nights and still choose to shine. And sometimes the coldest hearts only need someone brave enough to show them the warmth they forgot long ago. This story reminds us never to judge anyone by appearances or social status. A humble caregiver like Eve can carry a heart of pure gold, while a polished heiress like Serena can hide a cruel soul inside. Look at how someone treats the vulnerable, the ones who can't offer them anything in return. That's the real measure of character. And remember that no matter how hard life gets, no matter how much suffering you're forced to endure, don't ever let it extinguish the light inside you, because that light will guide you to the people who truly deserve you, to the happiness you deserve. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. We'd love to know how you feel about this story. Which moment moved you the most? Have you ever met someone like Eve in real life? Someone who endured so much pain and still kept a kind heart? Or have you ever been the person someone rescued from the dark, the way Vincent was? Share your story in the comments below. We're always listening, and we truly value every share that comes from the deepest part of your heart. Finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.